Captain Midnight.
This video is brought to you by CuriosityStream, and it contains spoilers. Spider-Boy, Iron Boy, Iron Man Jr. In my time on this channel, I've made maybe more than my fair share of videos about the MCU Spider-Man. So I've read at least one comment containing a dismissive nickname like this every day since July 2017, I guess? Wow, long time. When people criticize Tom Holland's Spider-Man, this is generally one of the things they say. This is a Peter Parker who lives in Tony Stark's shadow, a goofy kid bumbling around while the more established heroes help him out. He's a glorified sidekick who has to lean on Iron Man's tech to get anything done. Now here we are 2 years later with Spider-Man Far From Home, a movie that does something pretty interesting, I think. It stars a Spider-Man who's really afraid that all of those things might be true. And if they are, what kind of hero does that make him? There's been countless versions of Peter Parker through the years, but one thing they tend to have in common is being racked with a certain amount of insecurity, guilt, and a little anxiety. Peter doesn't have the ironclad ego of Tony Stark, or the moral certitude of Steve Rogers, and he knows it. Peter is overwhelmed at the amount of questions being thrown at him about if he's going to be the one to step up and lead the Avengers after Tony Stark has died. I've seen a lot of criticism thrown at both Far From Home and Homecoming for having villains that directly relate to Tony Stark and his company. But speaking for myself, this is actually one of the best things these movies have going for them. Look at the other Avengers who have their own film series. Thor and Captain Marvel are often off in space. Cap could usually be found at HQ or some military base when not off on a mission, and Tony was a billionaire whose life had very little in common with your average person living in the MCU. Not Peter Parker. Spider-Man's films are the ones where we see things from the perspective of normal people. While most MCU heroes are dealing with aliens, magic rocks, and world-ending consequences, Spidey is the one left to deal with the results of those events. The one who sees from a street-level perspective the consequences of all these massive changes that have happened. And to me, it doesn't get much more Peter Parker than that. He's the ultimate everyman, so I think he's the perfect fit for that perspective.
He arrives just in time. Spider-Man, Spider-Man, friendly neighbor.
Far From Home is a movie that has to serve two purposes at once. It needs to function as both a sequel to Homecoming and give us our first look at the world of the MCU post-Endgame. And those are two films with very, very different tones. How you think it balances those two things is probably a decent indication on how you'll feel about this movie in general. The film begins with a montage of all the heroes we lost in Endgame. I know a lot of people weren't into this, but I really liked how it went about re-establishing this world through the lens of regular high school kids. We saw the big important heroes mourn in Endgame. This doesn't need to be that. It stays true to the tone of Homecoming by giving us something that resembles, surprisingly well actually, a badly edited montage you'd see on Instagram or Twitter after a celebrity dies. After that, we're dropped into Midtown High's new normal, with the movie smoothly laying out what the blip has meant for everyone. The blip isn't the focus of the film, far from it honestly, but I still think they did a really great job of integrating it into the story. Peter's romantic rival Brad is a good example of this. Making him a classmate they knew as a kid, only to come back and have him be 5 years older, was a small but clever way to use what could have been a real narrative stumbling block to the movie's advantage. Little details like that, or Peter's teacher describing how his wife faked her own blip to leave him, weren't just funny, they made the MCU feel like a living, breathing place in a way that we don't get to see very often. Is it a little convenient that none of the major players from Homecoming seem to have blipped? Yeah, definitely, and I really would have appreciated at least a stray line here or there about how someone tried to text Liz when they got back only to find out she was 5 years older. I think something like that would have gone a long way to at least lampshade the issue, but overall, I mean come on, 50% of the population is a lot of people. So even if you're the kind of person who gets really hung up on that kind of thing, I wouldn't call this a huge problem for the movie. Probably much more important is how you feel about the teen dramedy aspect of the movie, which, maybe even more than the action, is what both this and Homecoming live and die by. and I understand this can be very easy to dismiss. Spend 5 minutes online and you'll find comparisons to the Disney Channel and people writing it off as simple teen romance. Now I understand if that just isn't your thing, but I think those comparisons can be a little lazy. This is a genre like any other. It can be done well and it can be done poorly. And when it is done well, I think it can be really great. Sure, not every joke lands in Far From Home, but I do think Watts & Company do a pretty great job here. An example would be the scene where Peter opens the airplane bathroom door, sees MJ, quickly closes it, cleans the entire room, messes with his hair, and then is finally ready to let her in, only to see Brad instead. That's a really simple joke, but one that feels very true to the character, and it doesn't feel like something I've seen a million times already. And I think that's one of the best things about these movies. The humor in these movies usually come from smart observations about the characters' personalities, not just a cheap gag. And since we're talking about the teen characters, I might as well get into one of them a bit here. I didn't touch on MJ much in the Homecoming videos because, really, there just wasn't all that much there yet. It was clear that they were just setting her up to be more important down the road. And I know she has her critics, being a vast departure in personality from the original MJ, but honestly, I thought she was pretty great here. Now, I will say I would have liked a few more scenes with her. The fact that we have so little backstory or knowledge about her outside of her experiences with Peter can be a little frustrating. In the first Raimi movie, one of MJ's early scenes sees her storming out of her house while her parents scream at each other, before talking to Peter in the backyard. This isn't like a ton of backstory by any means, but it managed to say a lot with a little, and gave us some much needed insight into the character at an early stage. But I do really like what Zendaya brings to the table. Whether she's Michelle Jones or Mary Jane or whatever, I don't have a big problem with MJ being different here. I mean, I grew up reading the Ultimate comics as a kid, and the nerdy best friend MJ found there is a pretty huge departure from the original. Even the Raimi version, job aside, has little in common with the actual personality of 616 universe Mary Jane. So I don't think there's anything wrong with a new version of the character that takes a different approach. And I think the moment where she really clicked as a character for me was the scene on the bridge in Prague, where she quickly tells Peter that people used to be executed there. But she doesn't say it with the Aubrey Plaza laid-back cool that she usually would. She's actually really awkward about it. She was really nervous here, so her first impulse was to say something edgy but true to kinda smooth over that feeling. I thought that explained a lot about the character and added some much-needed dimension to her, even though I definitely would like more backstory in the future.
In 1 hour. Hey, don't look at me. Maybe you didn't deliver his paper this morning.
And of course, we have to talk about Mysterio. Pretty much everyone's favorite self-serious fishbowl head. And I really think they nailed it. Mysterio is everything I wanted him to be here, while also serving as a very good example of what the MCU can be when it uses continuity in a smart way. Jake Gyllenhaal is different from classic Quentin Beck in a few very big ways. He's the guy who can easily slip into the role of a Tony Stark-esque hero. Unlike the comic version, who's generally an awkward dude with a terrible haircut. But at the core, where it really counts, Mysterio still retains his defining characteristics. He's a deeply bitter guy with a lot of anger at the world for not recognizing his talent and genius, and someone who really, really wants to be seen as impressive. Mysterio's first ever appearance in Amazing Spider-Man 13 begins with him framing the webhead for a crime. And intentional or not, I kind of liked how that was the grand finale of his story here too. His illusions were pretty much what I hoped they could be. I especially liked the imagery of Spider-Man inside a snow globe city, inside Beck's helmet. That just felt very classic Mysterio. His backstory, working in past continuity from the MCU, was also really well done, I thought, with his big exposition scene being one of the most ridiculous, but also one of the most fun things in the entire movie. Gyllenhaal's performance was great too, being just a little too polished and nice early on, and then moving into being an incredibly fast-talking, kind of condescending psycho with an obsessive quality that really recalled his role in Nightcrawler. But how was Spider-Man himself? Well, if I had one big criticism of the MCU Spidey, it's that the working class aspect of the character feels like it's kind of been lost in a cloud of fancy tech. Financial issues just don't seem to be a thing that play a role in Peter's life, as it hasn't been brought up very much since Civil War. Apparently there was a deleted scene where he had to sell all of his Star Wars collectibles to afford going on the class trip. I really wish that had made the final cut, because I do think it's a really important aspect of what separates Spider-Man from your Iron Mans and your Thors. But aside from that, I was very on board with how the movie handled him. Peter's central story, the weight of living up to expectations that he's not quite sure he can bear, is an MCU twist on a classic Parker problem, and his breakdown on the plane with Happy was a real highlight of the movie. As Peter walks around these cities, he sees tributes to Iron Man that almost treat him as a religious figure. And who can blame them? He literally died for half of all life on Earth. No one can live up to that. And that's essentially what Happy tells him. All he can do is go out there and try his best. As Peter puts together a new suit though, Happy plays Back in Black as an obvious nod to Iron Man. This probably bothers some people, but I think it makes sense for this Spider-Man. Tony Stark has played a huge role in his life. And as much as Homecoming skeptics may hate that, I feel like it would be weird for Far From Home to downplay it. He was really inspired by Tony Stark in this universe, and I don't think that makes him any less Spider-Man because of it. The core of the character was and remains that sense of responsibility and balancing that with his personal life, which is absolutely the focus of Far From Home. Okay, I'm usually one to complain about third act MCU battles going on too long, but I have to admit, I was really engaged throughout the whole thing here. Karen, Spidey's AI from Homecoming, is really nowhere to be found, probably because he has Beck or Happy to talk to for most of the movie while he's in costume, so it's just less necessary. I also just thought this movie did a better job with the action set pieces. Spider-Man was fast, fluid, and always improvising, giving every fight scene a chaotic, like barely pulling this off energy that just felt right to me. This is really specific, but I've always loved when Spider-Man's web shooters run out or aren't totally working, and he has to work without them. Spectacular Spider-Man captured that really well, and finally the movies really have here too. There was less an emphasis on gadgets and different styles of webbing, and a lot more of just Peter thinking on his feet during combat. So while no one is gonna mistake John Watts for like George Miller or anything, I think he managed a big step up in how he directed this stuff, both in the final battle and in the illusion segments.
The Spider-Man web shooter supports the weight of toys only, doll and truck not included.
Finally, there's the post-credit scenes, which are huge. The last one with Nick Fury I actually wasn't that into. I thought Fury came off as both really dull and kind of dumb for the majority of this film, and while this scene explains that away, it still wasn't exactly exciting. I just don't care enough about the MCU Fury at this point to be all that interested in what he's up to. But okay, let's talk about the other one. Seeing J.K. Simmons as a new, modernized version of J. Jonah Jameson was definitely cool, but more importantly, this scene totally changed Peter's life going forward. When people say this movie has no consequences for Peter Parker, I honestly do not get it. Avoiding his responsibility as a hero and passing Tony's glasses off to Mysterio obviously had massive consequences for him. His life will probably never be the same now, and that's all a direct result of his actions. I'm thinking this signals that the next Spider-Man movie will probably have a bit more of a dramatic tone. But either way, it got me very excited to see where they go next. Kraven, the Green Goblin, even the Sinister Six, there's so many possibilities for them to tackle. So yeah, I really liked Far From Home. I wouldn't call it my favorite Spider-Man movie, but it lived up to my expectations and sold me even more on this version of Peter Parker. It'll probably be a while before we see him again, but honestly, this street-level perspective on the MCU, with Spider-Man's petty, ego-driven villains, is maybe my favorite little corner of this universe, and I had a great time revisiting it here. You know, one of the most painfully relatable moments in this movie for me was when Ned corrected Happy on medieval weaponry, even as they were about to die. If you can relate, I highly recommend Castle Siege Defense on Curiosity Stream. This is a documentary about tearing down your preconceptions of what medieval castle warfare was like, and giving you a really interesting scientific and historical look at what it really was. I learned a lot from this one, and I mean, come on, it's medieval warfare. Who doesn't want to learn more about that? You can find it on Curiosity Stream. From the founder of the Discovery Channel, this is a great streaming platform if you love documentaries as much as I do. It has over 2,400 titles to choose from about everything from science, tech, history, and more. Curiosity Stream is available worldwide on a ton of devices and starts at the great price of $2.99 a month. In fact, you can all get 30 days on the service for free just by going to curiositystream.com/CaptainMidnight, which you'll find in the description and pinned comment below.
Here's a special tip for the fellas and girls who have not already joined Captain Midnight's new 1940 Flight Patrol. You'd better hurry up and join at once because there's a big adventure ahead. The thing to do now is to get started because we're going to have not only barrels of fun, but loads of free gifts and